Good morning. Thanks for taking some time out of your day to join us as we learn a little bit about early AFG-funded cardiovascular research. We'll take a minute here and allow people to join in. And once we see that stop, we'll get started. So if you just give us a couple minutes to allow people to get into the presentation, then we'll start. Okay, looks like we got a handful of people joining us, so that's great. So today's presentation by Dr. Denise Smith is part of a continuing series from the Nerdstock 2023 presentations that happened during the Fire Department Safety Officers Association conference in Florida this January. And it was really an idea that came from a handful of people that we've done a great job of setting the research agenda, but we really don't share as widely as possible, or it's maybe not as well known of what the research outcomes are from AFG funded research that came out of the early fire prevention and safety grants. And when you look at what those research projects are and how they impact the America's fire service, there's a lot of really incredible work that set the tone very early and continues through to today. And one of those people that was involved in the very early research and certainly continues phenomenal work today is Dr. Denise Smith. So Denise, we're happy to have you with us today to talk about your work in cardiovascular studies relative to firefighting. So with that, I'll hand control to you, and it's all yours.
Well, John, thanks for the introduction and thanks for hosting this. I'm thrilled to share some of the studies. I have picked just a few. Actually, I think I'm going to touch on 5 or 6 studies today. But if there was a goal I had in mind, it's to help people understand how important it is to have a research agenda that builds upon itself, and how important it is to have multiple studies that look at complex problems. And if there's a complex problem in the fire service, of course, cardiovascular disease is one that we could point to, because it's responsible for far too many fatalities in the fire service and far too much of a burden in terms of early disability, financial cost for departments, and disruption to individuals' lives. So with that, I'll walk through a few of the studies we've done and try to summarize where this brings us and what research continues to be needed in the area. So many years ago, my collaborators and I at the University of Illinois started a series of studies that really looked at firefighter fatalities and injuries. One of the things that was so important about this research was that it allowed us to address both the challenge of heat stress related to the PPE and the work that firefighters do, and the cardiovascular strain that they experience. So what researchers did in this case, and this was really in collaboration with Dr. Gavin Horn and other researchers at Illinois. This project itself, I believe, had 7 researchers involved. We looked at heat stress as a common factor that led both to overexertion that could contribute to fatigue and cardiovascular strain, and also to biomechanical changes that affect gait and risk for injuries, slip, trips, and fall injuries on the fire ground. But we also recognized that heat stress was a really important contributing factor to cardiovascular strain. So this was one of our first large-scale studies. We had done a series prior to this, but with the AFG funding, we were able to bring in more researchers, including from the University of Chicago. You see Dr. Bo Fernhall in the upper right-hand corner and Dr. Tom Rollins from Massachusetts. And we brought in sophisticated instrumentation, including cardiac ultrasound, that permitted us to look at how the cardiovascular, both the heart and the vessels of the body, were changing as a result of firefighting activity. We also were able to draw blood samples and take a more sophisticated look at how blood clotting and inflammatory markers were changing, again, to try to understand the cardiovascular strain in multiple systems or multiple components of the cardiovascular system with live firefighting work. So you see, we're actually in a bay, a training bay of a training tower. So we took firefighters into the bay for complete cardiovascular workup before and immediately after live firefighting activity. Now, in addition to the work that's done on the fire ground, which is so important in terms of characterizing cardiovascular strain, thermal strain of firefighting, it was also important for us to try to understand some of the individual factors that are associated with the strain. So during firefighting, firefighters perform strenuous work, and there's heat stress, and there's adrenaline. So in a situation like a laboratory at Skidmore College, or in field situations where we're actually looking at what's happening during 24 hours of duty, assuming it's a 24-hour on, 48-hour off shift, we can actually look at what's happening to the firefighter and build a better framework of how cardiovascular strain might lead to a cardiovascular event. So in this series of studies, this was an AFG-funded project awarded to Skidmore College, where we have a first responder health and safety laboratory. Now we started building a framework to separate the different components of firefighting work. So this is where we started to begin to think about, well, the PPE is increasing metabolic work and inhibiting the dissipation of heat, so it's adding to heat strain. The heavy work that firefighters do individually and by itself can contribute to triggering a cardiovascular event. And the hot and dangerous environment, we started better understanding that this wasn't just contributing to heat stress, but the lack of visibility, the multiple stressors here is actually leading to an adrenaline surge. And so as part of this study, we began framing how all of the components of the body are affecting the cardiovascular system itself. A follow-up study, again awarded to Skidmore College, was to try to address these twin challenges, to better understand the twin challenges of heat stress and dehydration. Now, on the fire ground, they often go together, and firefighters are sometimes so familiar with heat stress that they fail to understand how incredibly important it is in terms of driving detrimental cardiovascular consequences. And then heat stress is superimposed on dehydration, right? And I say this because firefighters often arrive on scene or arrive to a training scenario in a dehydrated state. But then the work itself further exacerbates the heat stress and dehydration because of the sweating. So once again, you'll see now on the left-hand portion of your screen, we're using a theoretical model to guide our investigation. And here we're saying that those three components that we identified in our earlier study, the muscular work, the heat stress, and dehydration, all function together to cause changes both in the heart itself, but in the blood vessels and even the blood, the platelets and clotting factors. And here's a very important framing for us. Thankfully, we know that although cardiac events are far too common, it's also the case that most firefighters do not suffer a cardiac event despite the cardiovascular strain. So we need a model to say, yes, we want to understand how the heat stress and dehydration compound to create cardiovascular strain, In the presence of underlying disease, now this is really critically important. In the presence of underlying disease, then this cardiovascular strain can lead to a sudden cardiac event. But in all firefighters, even when there's not a cardiovascular event, we're concerned about the cardiovascular strain caused by heat stress and dehydration and physical work, because it leads to early fatigue or impaired performance. Now, firefighters know this. At some point, you can't continue to replace your bottle and go back in. So understanding what we can do both to prevent cardiovascular events, but also what we can do to prevent early fatigue is important to us. Now, on the right-hand side of your screen, I show some data that shows what happens if I have a firefighter who has no heat stress and is normally hydrated, right? This would be a control condition. Or what happens if I allow a firefighter to be dehydrated but have no heat stress? Now, I can't do this with firefighters, but in a laboratory, I can. In a laboratory, I can have a firefighter do the same amount of work, but prevent heat stress by having cooling strategies. And in this case, we used a water-cooled suit that the firefighter wore under the PPE, so that although they were doing the same amount of work, the body temperature didn't go up. And then I can have them in a heat stress condition, but keep them properly hydrated. And on the far right-hand side, let me just call your attention to this data, the data presented in red. In this case, you see that the firefighter who's dehydrated and has heat stress superimposed on it has the most detrimental change in stiffness. Now, this is stiffness of an artery. We have looked at, I think we had maybe a dozen or more variables that we looked at. I'm just showing the stiffness of an artery because I want to make the point that we can do sophisticated measurements, including how stiff a vessel is, which is a detrimental change that we see during heat stress or during firefighting. And it is made worse when individuals are dehydrated. Excuse me. So the point is, the research allows us to investigate sophisticated mechanisms using state-of-the-art laboratory techniques, but it also allows us to have translatable research results for the fire service. It is important that you avoid dehydration for multiple reasons. Vascular stiffness is one of them. In the latest series of studies we've been doing, and now I'm going back to the work that I've done with the Illinois Fire Service Institute, along with my colleague Gavin Horn, colleagues from NIOSH, and also Underwriters Lab. Here we did a series of studies. I'm just going to lay out the framework for the first one, but here we wanted to look at both cardiovascular and chemical or carcinogenic exposure in a modern firefighting environment. Because once again, we think it's important from a research standpoint to do these large studies that look at firefighting in a comprehensive way. A firefighter isn't just exposed to cardiovascular strain or to chemical exposures or carcinogenic risk. These things happen in totality. So we wanted to create an environment that was realistic. So for this study, we actually built a residential structure. So it's not, the testing was performed on the training ground, but in a specially built residential structure that we outfitted with modern furnishings, because we know that the fuel load is important in terms of the heat stress that firefighters encounter, hence the cardiovascular response, and certainly the carcinogenic or chemical exposure. So for this study, once again, we're working with a theoretical framework that drives all of the research. And we're saying that with firefighting, you have both the heat that we've talked about now for several of the studies, and that heat can be measured in the environment. And certainly we had colleagues from UL that could describe that environment incredibly well for us. That heat is buffered from the human body by the PPE that's worn. And we did work with gear manufacturers on several of these studies, looking at alterations to that PPE. But then we can actually look at the level of the firefighter shown in this schematic in the gray. We measure core temperature and skin temperature, so we understand how the heat is affecting the body. But the fire also causes, in addition to the heat, the products of combustion. And the fire service has become increasingly aware of this challenge. This study was funded, I believe, in 2013, and was the first in a series of 4 such studies that were funded. But in terms of the products of combustion, again, we're measuring it in the air. We're measuring it on the PPE and looking to see how the PPE protects against exposure. And then we also measure it on the firefighter, right? The skin of the firefighter, and what gets absorbed into the firefighter's body, either through absorption or inhalation. So the focus of the study, of course, is on the firefighter. But before we get to the firefighter, we have to understand the levels of exposure. And in this study, focusing on the cardiovascular side, because that's what I was asked to address today, we looked at many cardiovascular responses. So we had ECGs, we looked at blood clotting, inflammation, and also the metabolites from the products of combustion. After that series of studies, and I'm sorry I didn't mention before I changed the slide, but after that, that large-scale study looking at residential structures, we went on and did a study looking at training structure and different training fuels using that same model and many of the same outcome variables. And then we had a series of studies looking at changes to PPE, whether it's the particulate blocking hood, doffing procedures, interface control, to understand how different factors related to the PPE could affect our outcome variables. Now permit me to transition to another study that was done, this one again, a laboratory-based, or actually an epidemiologically based study that was awarded to Skidmore College to look at cardiac fatalities in the fire service. We did this in partnership with the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation. They helped us obtain autopsy results from firefighters who died in the line of duty over the last 20 years. And maybe I'd call your attention again to the model that we're using to guide our investigation and drive our hypotheses. But in this model, you see highlighted in red the cardiac cases. So we knew the individuals who had died of a cardiac cause versus what we would call in this study design our controls. These are firefighters who have died from non-cardiac causes, often trauma, vehicle accidents, or fire-related events. But when we're looking at the cardiac causes of death, we can now compare a group of firefighters who died from cardiac causes to those who did not. So it's a strong research design. We can also compare it back to the general population for some research questions. But let me say this, the fire service has known that cardiac events are the leading cause of acute line of duty death, right? In other words, events that are related proximally, like within an hour, within 24 hours of firefighting. And this has been true since the NFPA has been keeping records. And despite that knowledge, we actually have very little understanding up until this project was performed on what was the underlying pathoanatomic cause of that death. Was it related to a heart attack, as many had thought, or was it a cardiac arrest due to a structurally enlarged or otherwise damaged heart? So now if we look at those red cardiac cases that are shown in your model, you can see that we went through all of these autopsies and determined, did the individual firefighter have coronary heart disease? That is atherosclerosis in the coronary arteries. Did they have cardiomegaly, an enlarged heart, or left ventricular hypertrophy, which is a thickening of the heart? And this is an indication of actual structural damage to the heart as a result of hypertension or obesity or coronary artery disease. Or did they have both? Or did they have another cause of cardiovascular death? You can die from a cardiovascularly damaged heart with a valvular damage or infectious disease. Those are much less common, but some of our cardiac deaths did fall into that category. On the right-hand side of the screen, I show you that as hypothesized, a large percentage of the cardiac cases did have coronary artery disease, right? That was evidenced by narrowing of the vessel or stenosis. In fact, 73% of the cardiac cases had this evidence of atherosclerosis. Now, some people may have thought or hypothesized that all of the cardiac cases would have had underlying coronary artery disease with at least 50% stenosis. But in fact, we know pathologically that sometimes the plaque that's most vulnerable to rupture really doesn't cause severe stenosis. The other finding, and again, this research was the first to show this in a firefighting population. 77% of the firefighters who died of a cardiac event had a heart rate over 450 grams. This is called cardiomegaly clinically. It means a structurally enlarged heart. And another series of research we did has shown that this is most common in firefighters with obesity or hypertension or coronary artery disease or sleep apnea. So again, in terms of translating the findings, this is not just to understand underlying mechanisms. We want to understand the underlying mechanisms so we can understand the firefighters who are most at risk and treat them. But this tells us clearly that we have to be paying attention to hypertension in the fire service, treat it early to mitigate damage. We have to be attentive to obesity and sleep apnea in the fire service, and also the traditional cardiovascular risk factors. If I could, just to point out what was a surprise to me, was that 80% of the cardiac deaths had both. It wasn't one or the other. It was both coronary artery disease and hypertensive heart disease or cardiomegaly. In fact, 80% of the fatalities fell into both categories. And the reason I want to point this out as such a significant finding is, for me, this means we need to be thinking about our medical evaluations, our occupational medical evaluations, and know that we are looking for both of these underlying cardiovascular conditions and then recommending strategies to mitigate them. So we've published our findings, as we're supposed to do, in the medical literature, so that the fire service can be guided by strong, peer-reviewed scientific evidence. But in my view, the greatest measure of the importance of this research will come if it guides recommendations for better screening for the fire service. And I'm happy to tell you that the NFPA 1582 committee has just begun investigating the use of coronary artery calcium scans in order to provide enhanced screening. You will be updated on that, certainly. I'm nearing the end of my presentation, and I just want to leave you with a theoretical model, because sometimes I hear this in the fire service that maybe we've already studied cardiovascular disease. We know that. There's already been a study that's looked at that. But in terms of researching a complex problem like cardiovascular disease or behavioral health or carcinogenic risk, when we're looking at complex problems in the fire service, we don't need one study or two studies to look at them. We must have a series of studies that build upon themselves in terms of understanding the problem. So just as a quick update on where I think we are in understanding the problem of cardiovascular events or cardiovascular disease in the fire service, I would say we've documented the cardiovascular strain of firefighting. We know it leads to changes in the heart muscle itself, the blood vessels, and the blood. It becomes thicker, more likely to clot. Most people recover, most firefighters recover with an appropriate rehab and recovery time. although I will note that not enough firefighters are getting adequate recovery time, given the challenges that they're facing with staffing. But the cardiovascular strain of firefighting is most dangerous in those who have underlying cardiovascular disease, whether it's coronary heart disease, atherosclerosis, or the structurally altered heart. And in those cases, the firefighter is vulnerable either to plaque rupture and a thrombus formation or an arrhythmia, and these two interact. Again, it's a complex problem. And this can lead to a cardiovascular event. And I want to alert the fire service when we talk about sudden cardiac events. I think our minds go to the number of fatalities that are reported each year. But I want to remind you, it's not just the fatalities. That's the tip of the iceberg, if you will. There's another 1,000 or so firefighters that have a non-fatal cardiac event on the fire ground, right? Reported through NFIRS. Now, I know that that's underreported. And in terms of the cardiovascular burden, it's not just those that occur on the fire ground we're concerned about. We actually care about the cardiovascular events that are occurring not on the fire ground and not even related to duty, but are just taking guys off the job or causing pain and suffering or cost to the department as these firefighters go out on disability or early retirement. So the cardiovascular events far greater than just the fatalities that we tend to reference. So where are we as a result of this series, I think, of 5 studies and many others that we've done? We've been able to characterize the cardiovascular and thermal strain of firefighting. And I will say this, I think firefighting places the greatest strain on the cardiovascular system of any work we've seen or that has been considered in the literature. There's considerable cardiovascular risk and carcinogenic exposure that we've been able to look at in a comprehensive way, recognizing that the firefighters experience all of these risks simultaneously. We've placed the cardiovascular and the strain in the context of the occupational stressors, right? The work shift, the sleep disruption, the cultural changes, the interrupted eating patterns. We place that in the context of what firefighters face so that we can understand the complex nature of cardiovascular risk to firefighters as separate from the rest of the population. And we've identified the pathoanatomic cause of death and begun to recommend targeted, specific enhanced screening for firefighters. And yet there's a lot that remains to be done. There's a lot that remains to be done. And much of this must be done in collaboration with the fire service. We need to continue to push to make sure that all firefighters are getting not only medical evaluations, but proper medical evaluations that are using appropriate screening and where the provider understands the physiological and psychological strain associated with firefighting. And if there's one thing we can do, we need to make sure that firefighters are physically fit and healthy enough to do the job that we're asking them to do. And we need to make sure not only is that programming available, that we help provide the motivation and context to support firefighters as they undertake that. And despite the research that has been done, there's much more that needs to be done in terms of the emerging risk. It turns out that the fire service is facing more work because of understaffing. They're facing greater heat stress because we're asking the PPE to be more protective against carcinogenic risk. This means that it creates more of a heat stress burden in many cases. Changes in the climate. Firefighters are going to more events. The events they're going to are hotter. Changes in materials that are burning create greater chemical exposure risk and greater heat stress risk, which complicates or compounds cardiovascular strain. Additional research actually needs to understand how the cardiovascular strain intersects with cardiometabolic or metabolic strain. We're seeing a big increase in metabolic syndrome and diabetes in the fire service, as well as in the general population. And we need to better understand the immunological changes, right? The number of circulating white blood cells and inflammation changes with firefighting, There's hormonal disruption to firefighting that we've just begun to understand, but that hormonal disruption is important in and of itself, but also as it relates to cardiovascular risk. For instance, firefighters who have low testosterone are at increased cardiovascular risk. But also firefighters who are supplementing with testosterone when it's not needed for physiological reasons appear to be at increased risk for cardiovascular events. So we certainly need more research there. And also understanding how cardiovascular risk intersects with other conditions, whether it's fatty liver disease or other metabolic disruptions, or even infectious disease. One that's very much on my mind is that there's now compelling evidence from large-scale studies showing that post-COVID infection, there's an increased risk of cardiovascular events related to myocardial infarctions and arrhythmias. The early data suggests that those with more severe COVID disease are at greater risk, but anyone who had COVID is at elevated risk compared to no COVID. So that has not been studied in the fire service, but general population-based data and coming from the military sources suggests that this is one more thing that we must continue to be focused on. So I'd leave you with the thought that AFG funding has dramatically increased our understanding of cardiovascular issues in the fire service. This has helped keep firefighters safer. There's more work that the fire service must do to implement that research. And there's certainly more research we must do to ensure that the firefighters who are working to protect the communities they serve are healthy enough to do so without undue risk to themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. And I think that absolutely nails the genesis of why we had the conversation about Nerdstock is for younger members of the fire service that are coming in, and even incumbent members. Like you have to stay hydrated. You have to stay hydrated. You have to stay hydrated. And I'm sure there's a segment of the population is like, well, why? I'll drink water when I'm thirsty, or activity beverage or whatever. Well, that research is pretty compelling to say that, and it's absolutely fact. The fire service is chronically dehydrated and chronically underslept. Yeah. And you have the data and information to prove it. And the same, from medical physicals and heat stress and everything else. So absolutely spot on, and really one of the foundational elements, some of the foundational elements for things that are still, today. I appreciate what you shared, and maybe expand upon it a little bit, that there really isn't ever any period of we're done, right? You can't ever check the box and go like, yep, we got that. It's all set and we never have to do anything more.
Well, John, I will tell you this. There's nothing I would like more than to be done with cardiovascular research. But just as you said, until we get to the point where firefighters are not suffering cardiac events, fatal or unfatal, or having careers cut short because of cardiovascular disease, or entering retirement and not being able to enjoy those years that they so richly deserve. Until we get firefighters to that point, then I agree 100% with you. We're not done. The research must continue, and the researchers and fire service must work together to implement that research to keep the firefighters safe.
And I think there's, along with that, there's a moral imperative from fire service leaders to ensure that, I don't say at all costs, but this still needs to be a priority for every fire department, that a good medical physical before you join the fire service, and at an appropriate interval throughout your entire fire service career shouldn't be a subject of debate. It should be just one of those things that we accept the same as water is wet, fire is hot, and fire trucks are red. I mean, it should be one of those things that we just do. Yeah. So I appreciate everything that you've done to to drive this forward and continue to do this, because I posted it this morning, and I mean it with all sincerity. You're certainly one of the original people that put their life's work into the fire service, and the fire service certainly owes you a tremendous debt of gratitude, and certainly a lot of researchers, but certainly what you've done in the cardiac sphere that has made things better for people like me that have been in the fire service for pretty much their entire adult life.
Thanks, John. That means the world to me. I just have to say it's a collaboration. If there's one more thing to say about research, it's never done by a single person. It's a team that comes together. And in this case, it's a team that comes together with a commitment to support the fire service. So thank you.
Oh, you are welcome. We're fortunate to have that entire research team. So we have a handful of people in the webinar live, and we've got a couple of minutes left. Denise, if you wouldn't mind, I'd open it up to the population to see if there's any questions, and we can maybe take 5-10 minutes here to nudge around with those and see what we got.
Happily. Mel,
so participants, that's all I have is listed as participants. If you have a question, if you could raise your hand, we'll acknowledge you and see if we can get I see Joe, you look like the first person with a question. I believe you're unmuted. If you could just go ahead.
Yeah, good morning. I'm interested in doctor's opinion on the cardiovascular CAT scans and the value of those. I think you commented on them as far as the NFPA goes. I had a little personal experience with it. I had one done and it came out, pretty high. And my cardiologist alluded to the fact that it's normal for a firefighter to have a high calcium score because of the product's combustion that we see, and our sleep cycles and everything else. So any opinion on that?
Yeah, Joe, thanks. It's a great question. And I'm really glad you got a coronary artery scan, right? Let me just, for everyone listening, the coronary artery calcium scan, sometimes it's called a CT scan. This is a low dose scan that allows very quickly, non-invasively, to actually look at the coronary arteries to see the extent to which there's calcified plaque in the coronary arteries. Now, there's two things to note. One is this is a very, very good tool. It's looking at the overall burden of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. But it's not perfect. It's not perfect. I alluded to this very quickly in my presentation, because the plaque that ruptures is often soft, vulnerable plaque. So you can have a high coronary artery calcium scan with calcified plaque, and the plaque may not rupture, so it's not going to bother you. You could have what shows as no calcium and still have a plaque that's vulnerable. So I will reiterate, cardiovascular disease is a complex disease process. But having said that, I think the coronary artery calcium scan is one of the most powerful ways to detect atherosclerosis. And I hope we see more departments using them. Because now, instead of just doing risk factors, right? With the risk factors, if you're doing blood lipids and triglycerides, your physician or your healthcare provider is trying to predict who's at risk. With a coronary artery calcium scan, you know, right? You have a much better visibility of the risk that a firefighter is facing. Now, probably not a good idea for me to disagree with a cardiologist when I'm speaking on a webinar, but I would push just a little bit. I don't want to accept that it is normal for a firefighter to have a higher coronary artery calcium score. I think I understand the research that he or she is referring to. There has been some limited research that shows that firefighters have higher coronary artery calcium scans than the general population. We need more research to verify that. I'm not sure that that's going to be true in a large population of firefighters. But whether or not it's true because of occupational factors, like exposures to carcinogens, or behavioral factors, like lack of exercise or greater levels of obesity, we don't know. But maybe you would permit me, Joe, to say one more thing. And that is, if we use a coronary artery calcium scan, to answer your question, I think we should. Some departments are moving in that direction. And if you're asking my opinion, I think more should, because firefighters deserve the best technology to understand cardiovascular risk. So I'm completely in support of it. But the second thing I want to say to my friends in the fire service is I view this a little bit like a 360 size up. It's essential. It's essential. If you accept my premise that in order to be an effective firefighter, you should be healthy enough to do so, fit and healthy enough to do so, then the first thing we should do is get the best intelligence we can. We should use the best screening we can. And right now, I think that is a coronary artery calcium scan. But my follow-up to that is that once you do a 360 size up, it's incumbent upon you to use the information. It's incumbent upon you to use the information. So every firefighter who's getting a medical evaluation, that's fantastic, but it's only going to be powerful if you use the information. So if you have information that you have elevated blood pressure, it's really critical that you take steps to lower that, either lifestyle changes or medication, right? But you must lower your blood pressure if you find a risk. And I'd say the same thing with a coronary artery calcium scan. You need to work with your cardiologist to mitigate the risk. And there's some things that they can do, statin medication, et cetera, can decrease the risk of a plaque rupture. There are multiple things that most of us can do to be healthier. And I would urge that once you get an indication of a problem, that our mindset be that we mitigate that risk. Joe, I hope that was helpful.
Very helpful. That answers my question. And I think that's something we'll add to our annual physicals. It's a
fantastic. That is fantastic.
And I'd add too that it's not just relative to firefighter physicals. It's in a lot of segments of the fire service, we've become fixated on a single thing being the answer to all of our problems. And certainly in this sphere, it's not one thing, it's everything. Excuse me, everything. So I think the robustness of your annual physical, and including calcium score, and all of the, like, use every tool that you have available to you to get the most holistic picture, as Denise said, the full 360 of what you have going on, and then listen to it. We should not, as firefighters, get to a point where, well, you're a firefighter, it's just going to be that way. I agree. Like, we need to invest in ourselves the same way that we invest in our people, and take advantage of those opportunities to get a holistic medical physical, and then act upon it, and to make sure that we're taking those. And even if you feel fine, it's like, well, I feel fine, but take advantage of those opportunities that maybe, it's something gradual, that if you fix it, you will feel better. But, thanks for the question, Joe. I really appreciate it, because it is always the curiosity of, like, well, should I do this or should I do that? And what's the result mean? And how do I apply it to everything else that I do?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. I've actually got to run. We've got personal trainers coming to the station this morning, and I'm going to go work out.
Good for
That's
you.
Great. That's great.
Have a great day.
You as well. Thank you, John. Anyone else have a question for Dr. Smith before we wrap this up this morning? All right. Seeing no raised hands, some final thought, Denise?
No, I appreciated your comments, John. And I was just thinking, when you were saying, yeah, let's use all the tools in the toolkit. Let's make sure we're proactive, that we don't just accept some negative health trajectories. I just couldn't help but think, what? One of the great things about working with the fire services, these guys believe they can fix anything. And I agree with them. I watch them, like, they're creative, they're tenacious, and they believe they can make the system better. They can fix the situation. If they just bring that attitude to their own health, that would be an enormous leap forward, because they have a lot they can do. And when you get a question like, Joe, like, what should we do? And he's like, great, let's go ahead and translate that into annual medical exams. Like, that proactive approach to health and safety in the fire service is really going to save lives.
That proactive approach to individual, organizational, and certainly the fire service is a sphere, but you're right, it starts with you as an individual, and everything that the incredibly smart, tenacious, and brilliant people such as yourself have done doesn't do any good if it just sits on a shelf someplace. It's up to us from a fire service perspective to just take it and make it live. So thank you for that.
Yeah, you bet.
So that completes our conversation for today about early research and ongoing research relative to cardiac events. Appreciate everybody's participation and taking time out of their day to listen. And Denise, appreciate you, everything that you've done and that you brought for us today.
Thanks, John. It's great to be with you guys, as always.
Guys, everybody have a great day.
Bye-bye.